Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Bob Hart, Executive Director for Lane County History Museum, or Historical Society and History Museum, if you wish. And we are always pleased to be the co-hosts of the history pubs that are currently going on in conjunction with the University of Oregon's Department of History. And I'm about to introduce Dr. Marcia Weisiger, who is going to introduce our speaker. But before I do that, I want you to know a little bit about Marcia, because Marcia was one of the 3 historians who was involved in doing the study of Deedy and Dunn halls at the university. So if you have questions perhaps later about that subject, Marcia is the one to talk to. So we are delighted, I am delighted to, as I said, be a co-host with the Department of History, and in particular with Dr. Marcia Weisiger, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Thanks. Marcia.
Thank you, Bob. I didn't expect that. Okay, so I am Marcia Weisiger, and first I want to give a shout out to Viking Bracket for helping to host this event, and especially to Jonna Threkheld. Am I pronouncing that correct?
Yeah, pretty close.
Okay. All that German study did not help me with that, but for all of your help with the arrangements, because you've been great to work with. And I'd also like to give a shout out to one of our staff members at the University of Oregon's Department of History, Phelan McWhorter, who designed the beautiful posters that helped to advertise this event and was also put out for advertising, because she is a miracle, I guess, and has done a really great job for us. So now I'd like to introduce you to Professor Cynthia Prescott, who is an associate professor of history at, is that correct still? At the University of North Dakota. She'll become a full professor soon, I'm confident, because she's published her 2nd book. But she has come all this way from North Dakota to make a presentation to us in connection with her newly published book, Pioneer Mother Monuments, Constructing Cultural Memory. And Scott Langfield, Landfield rather, is here from Tsunami Books. He's brought copies of her books, which will be available for her to sign afterwards. Dr. Prescott earned her PhD at UCLA, and her work is focused on gender in the American West. She combines social history and material culture methods, like monuments, to study the intersections of gender, social class, and historical memory. In addition to writing Pioneer Mother Monuments, she is the author of another book, Gender and Generation, on the Far Western Frontier, which traced changing gender roles and ideology among early white settlers in Oregon between 1845 and 1900. I know there's some people in the audience who will probably be very interested in that. So at any rate, I'd like to welcome Cynthia Prescott. Please give her a big hand.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here tonight, and please forgive me. I tend to move when I talk, so I'm going to try and remember to stay in front of the microphone. If you can't hear me, please wave at me and remind me that I'm supposed to be talking this way so that you can hear me in this lovely cavernous space. So I'm going to be sharing tonight some of my research, which is drawn from my new book about pioneer monuments. But I'm going to focus on Oregon. My first research love was here in Oregon, and specifically on the Willamette Valley and people who migrated west to the Willamette Valley on the Oregon Trail. But this project then seeks to ask, how do we remember them in the 20th century? How do we think about that, and how has that changed over time? This started out as a question of, well, okay, I looked at some of the pioneer monuments in the Willamette Valley in my first project, and then I wanted to know, well, how typical was that of the rest of the country? And I thought it was just a project about the 1920s and early 1930s, and then people kept saying, oh, well, I don't know where that statue is. I've never heard of that you're looking for, but you should really go look at this other thing over here that was put up in the 1970s or 1890s. Okay, and then the projects are sort of ballooned from there. So the longer book project looks at about 200 pioneer monuments erected from the 1880s up to the present. The most recent went up in 2018, I believe. So it's a process that's still ongoing. And then looking at how the artists and people who donated the monuments, what they intended them to mean, and then how public reception of that, how the public's interpretation of those monuments has changed over time, leading up to recent controversies, which we'll touch on at the end. Okay. So I'm going to give us tonight a kind of chronological overview, as my book does, of pioneer monuments, but I'm going to focus on examples from Oregon, which I think will both tell you an Oregon story, because here we are in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, but also I think illustrate some broader points that show up in the book at large. So this will give you a flavor of the larger project as well. The earliest monuments that I look at were put up in the late 1880s, and I should pause and explain when I say pioneer monuments, what I mean, how I define that is statues or sculptural reliefs that depict early white settlers in the American West, that often get characterized as pioneers or pioneer mothers or pioneer women. And I include anything that has pioneer in the title, or that people sort of refer to as pioneer, or that include sort of the stereotypical images of a pioneer man in buckskin or a pioneer woman in a sunbonnet sort of thing. There are lots of other markers and tributes to pioneers, early settlers, that are not this sort of sculptural depiction that I won't be talking as much about today. There are also lots of sculptures that are portraits of individual famous people, such as Dee Dee and Lane and many others. Those I won't be talking about so much instead. I'm most interested in ones that are sort of a generic type of pioneer, will be what I'll be talking about. Okay, so with all of that sort of explanation out of the way, we can actually talk about some statues. The earliest ones put up in the 1890s up through about World War I really were pretty explicitly depicting a racial hierarchy in the West. And it was very clear, and in fact it was the intention of the people erecting these monuments to demonstrate that Western history was characterized by a progression from, in their terms, Indian savagery to white civilization, right? And so progress, with a capital P, we are depicting with these monuments. The one on the screen is from San Francisco, and it has Minerva, the goddess of war, at the top, representing Eureka, the spirit of California, and a golden bear. And then at the bottom, there are 49ers, and this one is called Early Days. It has a Spanish missionary towering over a prostrate Indian with a Mexican vaquero, cowboy waving a now missing lasso or whip or something over his head. Okay, so this is white civilization at the top, everything else, the goddess there, you read it from bottom to top was the intention, right? And this is pretty typical of the time. In Oregon, they weren't quite that explicit. Oregon doesn't have these literal towers of white supremacy in the same way that San Francisco, Denver, Salt Lake City all do. But in Oregon, the story was one of presenting the progress from native to white, native sort of clearing the path for white people. And this is something people have been working on for a long time. Back up my story a little bit. As early as 1883, W. Lair Hill urged, quote, some capable hand in the Oregon Pioneer Association to gather up the scattered materials and erect a monument to the state's pioneer mothers. Okay, so they're talking about this at a time when the first generation of people who came west on the trail are sort of old and dying off, right? We sort of think of the greatest generation today, and we remember World War II pioneers, World War II veterans, and we need to remember them before we die. Oregon pioneers were doing this in the 1880s, and they're determined to put up a monument specifically to pioneer mothers. They didn't quite accomplish that in the 1880s, but each subsequent generation did follow Hill's call in a variety of different ways, which we'll talk more about in a moment. The way that those depictions changed over time, I argue, reflect changing attitudes toward race relations and gender and many other things as well. Those changes then recent discussions about public memory have caused Oregonians to rethink the meaning of some of these beloved monuments. Particularly, this is true of the Pioneer Father on the University of Oregon campus, as he turns 100 years old this year, and people are starting to question what he represents. Okay. So, I'm sorry, get back on I should be following my notes, so I'll be less scattered. I apologize. Okay, so what is going on in Oregon? In Oregon, we don't have these towers to white pioneers, but we have depictions of Native peoples yielding to white settlement. In 1905, Oregon hosted the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, and a pair of statues, this one depicting, it's called Coming of the White Man, depicting two Native men pointing up the Columbia River it's not clear whether this is probably Lewis and Clark, but also by extension, everyone that came over the Oregon Trail later, watching them come, right? And then a tribute to Sakakawea, of course, the famed indigenous guide and interpreter for the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was erected to honor Sakakawea, as we sort of slightly more historically accurate pronunciation of her name, and as the plaque shows, I don't know if you can read it, to the memory of the pioneer mother of old Oregon. Okay, so Sakakawea was erected by a group of feminists, early feminists, and who were involved in fighting for women's suffrage and a variety of other causes, and they specifically sought out a female sculptor to create a sculpture of Sakakawea to honor her and this pioneer mother, right? She does double duty. So these two go up in Portland in 1905, and after the fair, they're moved to a little bit to Washington Park, so they stand there still today. Elsewhere in the Willamette Valley and beyond in the Oregon region, we see depictions of sturdy male pioneers. The one on your left is sculpted by Alan Newman and was erected in Salem in 1903 and Ashland in 1910. This one was cast in zinc, not a good choice to do pure zinc for a sculpture, and so they have degraded over time. Am I too close? Yeah. These sculptures have degraded over time. The one in Salem was toppled in a windstorm in, I think it was 1917, and not replaced. The one in Ashland, they're in the process of replacing with a bronze sculpture in the same design. Okay. And the one on your right is the circuit rider on the State House grounds in Salem from 1924. And then, of course, best known around here is the Pioneer by a Mr. Proctor, better known locally as the Pioneer Father on the University of Oregon campus. Okay, and so we see this progression from Native people sort of yielding the way to these sturdy, manly pioneers, right? Then in the 1920s, pioneer memory shifts a little bit. These solo male pioneers fall out of favor, and instead people start talking more and more about these pioneer mothers. This is happening at a time when people in the United States were very anxious about women's roles. Less concerned about Native people in 1925 than they were in 1890 or 95, right? Because by 1924, Native people had largely been moved. Those who had survived the results of white settlement were largely living on reservations or otherwise sort of out of the way. The emphasis was on assimilation. Native people were granted citizenship rights, if at least limited citizenship rights, and sort of seemed to become less of a concern. But social concerns in the 1920s seemed to focus more on women and also on so-called new immigration from Europe, which people are very anxious about, right? We have immigration restrictions coming in the mid-1920s. And all of this then gets played out in what I call a pioneer mother movement, in which some 24 monuments that look very much like the ones on the screen at the moment show up across the country. And 24 actually solo pioneer women with armed with a Bible or a rifle, often accompanied by an infant in arms or a young son. And then also we start to see couples and families start to appear as well, but in either case, the pioneer mother is sort of the central figure. And this is borne out in Oregon as well, and the surrounding area as well. So the pioneer mother joins the pioneer father on the University of Oregon campus. So the one on the left is in Ponca City, Oklahoma. The one on the right, this particular one is in Upland, California, but there are actually 12 of these Madonna of the Trail sculptures, identical ones, erected by the Daughters of the American Revolution to mark the National Old Trails Road. They stretch they're one per state from Maryland to California. So these, you might have come across these in your travels. Interestingly enough, California and not Oregon. They chose to follow the old national road from the East Coast through to Illinois and then follow the Santa Fe Trail and what became Route 66 to California instead of coming up to the Willamette Valley. Here in the Willamette Valley, we have the pioneer mother who joins the pioneer father, right? They're about 100 yards apart on the college campus, but on opposite sides of a historic building, one of the early buildings on campus. So you can't actually see them they can't see each other, right? And you can't see that one or the other when you're standing in front of one. But so she's there. Explicitly, the donor wanted her to represent his ancestors and more generally pioneer mothers of Oregon, resting from her labors late in life, right? There's a book in her lap, which you maybe can't see in the photo, but the plaques on either side of her, the base of the monument, one of which you can see here, depict this overland trail experience. So it's supporting her, but not actually showing her in that position. The one on the image on your right is from Vancouver, Washington, sculpted by Avard Fairbanks, who taught at the University of Oregon, taught art here for about 7 or 8 years in the 1920s. And he sculpted this pioneer mother for Vancouver, and then on the back of that sculpture is this image, which here so if you can make it out, a covered wagon with the mother. This is a pretty classic image from the time period of the 1920s, with the covered wagon cover, the wagon cover forming a sort of halo over her head, right? Again, the Madonna of the Trail idea. Fairbanks actually originally sculpted this 200-pound brass plaque was intended to mark the overland trail, the Oregon Trail, or across its route. And in the 1920s, he put one up there's one on a bridge in Seaside, Oregon. There's one in Baker City. And then he adapted it for Vancouver, Washington by instead of replacing the words Old Oregon Trail with the Pioneer Mother, excuse me, Pioneer Mothers, plural on the back. Right, so same image, just different words. Clearly, the emphasis is increasingly on this nurturing pioneer mother. Okay, and in Oregon, interestingly, or the former Oregon Territory, this sort of more nurturing, more passive pioneer mother really becomes present, whereas in other places, she's a stronger character, as the ones we saw a moment ago. Okay, after World War II, there's this interest in pioneer mothers fades somewhat, and the focus becomes on nuclear families. So this one from my adopted home state of North Dakota. That's March in North Dakota, by the way, that I was plowing through the snow to take this photo. It's on the State House lawn in Bismarck. This becomes typical. Mom, dad, and a strapping young son, sometimes depicted, in this case, depicted as a probably 14-year-old, 15-year-old, about ready to start off on his own. Later, he gets younger. He was more like 7 or 8 or 10. But yeah, so sons, the family group, and then increasingly the emphasis becomes on this strapping son. Children are the hope of the future, right? In the midst of Cold War ideology and the obsession with the nuclear family in suburban life in post-war America. Okay. So what about in the state of Oregon's State House burned to the ground in the early 1930s. North Dakota's did too, by the way, so it's an interesting point of comparison, the architectural styles, but that's a tangent I'll try not to go into tonight. Oregon chose to create a new state house in the midst of the Great Depression that stripped away a lot of the typical sort of gilded dome, right, that's typical of state houses across much of the country, and go with this somewhat more modernist, or PWA modern is the art historical term for it, more simplistic lines, right, simple, pure lines, but then they decorated it with sculpture, architectural sculpture. Of course, most famously with the Gold Pioneer at the top of the not quite dome. And then to either side of the front doors are these massive marble bas-reliefs. Sorry, next slide. To the left is the Lewis and Clark expedition with Sakakawea, barefoot leading them westward, westward, the Star of Empire takes its way, the quote at the bottom. And then on the right, we have a valiant pioneer family, right? Dad is, once again, gazing out bravely, right? Mom is kneeling, trying to hold back her son who's eager to join the surprise, right? So there's a lot, and I showed you earlier the circuit rider that's on the State House grounds as well, right? So there was already a lot of pioneer art in Salem prior to World War II. But in 1940, Carroll Morse, who was a janitor and elevator operator in Salem, died and left us a modest estate. Most of that estate he left to the city of Salem to erect a pioneer monument. He didn't leave a lot of instructions on what that was supposed to look like. Okay, so now we have a committee to figure this out. The committee of learned men, and they were, I believe, all men, who were charged with choosing this, chose this piece, which had come up for auction. This is a Rodin Venus Victoria sculpture, which, while it had been very cutting edge when it was first cast in 1914, less so by 1940 in the art world. But the people of Salem were understandably shocked when they were informed that this was to become their tribute to the Oregon pioneer mother, right? One member of the Lions Club told Time magazine, "What we want is a statue of a pioneer woman in a gingham dress and a sunbonnet, not this trash." Okay, and this is exactly what we would expect, right? Given that this is the kind of imagery that was everywhere in the 1920s and 30s, what would you expect when in 1950 Salem was not a particularly cutting-edge place? This is not what they're expecting, right? And so then people are saying, no, this is not what we want. This is not what a pioneer mother looks like. This is not something you can possibly erect on the county courthouse grounds, right? This is not right. Okay, and so then they have to go back to the drawing board, right? The people who originally came up with this plan, it wasn't that they really thought this looked like a pioneer mother, right? They just said, hey, wait, there's a Rodin up and we've got the money to buy her, right? We've got to jump on this. Okay, but you can't just take any piece of art. The people of Salem are saying you can't just take any piece of art and call it a pioneer mother, right? There are meanings to these monuments besides just public art, right? Okay, so they then have a competition. What are people going to propose? People propose different things, and the people who attended the exhibition of the models, they actually favored this one, and I apologize for the very poor quality of the image. I've only been able to find a microfilmed version of a newspaper photograph of the piece. But so this is sculpted by a local artist, Francis Kells McColland, who called it a spirit of the Oregon pioneer. And he's nude. I don't know if you can make that out, but sort of nude, casting forward, sort of in the manner of a figurehead on a ship, perhaps, representing Oregon moving westward and moving forward, or something to that effect. By this point, though, city leaders are really kind of uncomfortable with taking any risks at all, because at this point, the national media is watching them, right? Time Magazine's stopping by to ask them what they think. And so the Park District gets involved. They become responsible for actually pulling this off, putting the thing somewhere. And they decide that Spirit of the Nude Oregon Pioneer isn't going to cut it. And they instead settle on the safe choice. Another work by Everett Fairbanks, the guy who had taught sculpture here at U of O, who sculpted the Pioneer Mother for Vancouver, Washington, and various other pioneer monuments in the meantime. And this very safe pioneer family. Again, a focus on the strapping son leading us into the future. The title, if you can read, Guidance of Youth. Right? And then on the back, he adapted once again his old Oregon Trail medallion, this time representing the Oregon centennial of Oregon statehood. This image gets reproduced on postage stamps. It becomes sort of the symbol of Oregon's state centennial in 1959. Okay. All right, so conservatism wins out, at least in the short run. Moving forward, we start to see people thinking about pioneer monuments in different ways. Whereas they had been kind of tribute to grandma, right, and an embodiment of white civilization and progress, right. Those pioneer mothers are doing both of those things, right, one more explicitly than the other. But in the later part of the 20th century, pioneer monuments become a way to promote heritage tourism. And so you put up a monument in order to convince people you're a historic place. If you don't have something truly historic like trail ruts to show, then you put up a bronze depiction of a pioneer, and that means that they're still there, right? One of my favorite examples, this is from 2007 in Oklahoma City, 150% life-size sculpture of the land rush, and one of the many Oklahoma land rushes, right? Okay. Similar things are going on here, not quite as explicit as what they did in Oklahoma City, but in Vancouver, Washington, that pioneer mother that was put up at the late 1920s was put up in Esther Short Park, which in the 1920s was a center of civic life in Vancouver. By the 1970s and 1980s, Esther Short Park was not someplace you wanted to be. It was taken over by drug dealers, there are homeless people seeking shelter there, and the Pioneer Mother monument, which had been in a lovely grotto tribute to her, just becomes overgrown, no one knows she's there. In the 1990s, Vancouver undertook a massive urban redevelopment plan, and totally transformed Esther Short Park, trying to make it a place people would actually want to come again, and the Pioneer Mother became a part of that. Now she's depicted now so they moved her not in a dark grotto for a contemplation, but plunked her, as you can see, right in front of the plaza, right in front of. She's facing a new urbanist strip of shops across the street, right? And there's this pavilion in the background. When I visited her in 2008, trying to get good photos of the sculpture, I couldn't get to the sculpture because there was a ballet troupe, young girls performing on the stage behind her, and the parents had all parked their cars around them. They've since then gotten better at controlling the car traffic, so you can't do that anymore, I don't think. But now it hosts farmers markets and so forth, right? And the Pioneer Mother has become just one of many bronze sculptures that are part of the public art in the plaza, without any real commentary of what she's supposed to mean, other than that, oh look, we have another nice piece of public art. Okay, so the 1980s, 1990s are a time of heritage tourism. They're also a time of culture wars in the United States. We have growing divides between urban and rural, progressive and conservative in the country, and that gets played out among many other venues in Western history and memory. Western history from the 1890s up through 1990 or so was taught as being a process of frontier settlement. You may have heard of Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, which really governed the field. And by the 1980s, you have a group of folks calling themselves the New Western Historians, who are arguing that Western history is not about frontier progress from Indians to white settlement and economic development. Rather, we should think of Western history as a process of conquest of native local lands and native peoples. We also have people starting to question then many other things, among it the depictions of native people in American history, American memory. For example, people are challenging celebrations of the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus landing in the New World. You have Native activists saying that's not something to celebrate, people. Let's talk about this, right? And so all of this sort of coalesces at a time when people are interested in, having renewed interest in pioneer monuments in certain places, right? So in more politically conservative places, pioneer monuments are a go-to thing, right? It's about cultural heritage, it's about heritage tourism. But in more progressive communities, that those images come and get challenged. Okay, so we have rural areas or small towns erecting monuments like this. This one is in Goodland, Kansas. The title of the town, give you some hint. The title of the sculpture is "They Came to Stay." Right? It's not subtle, folks. Right? The white settlers came to stay. And this is put up for the centennial of that county, the formation of that county, right? And there are 4 or 5 of these that go up in western Kansas alone in this time period, and like 3 in eastern Montana. At a time of the farm crisis of the 1980s, this is a firm message of people saying, hey, times are hard, but our people have persisted for 100 years and will be here still in another 100 years, right? They're carefully not thinking about where they came to stay or who was there before them, right? That gets erased. So they're not, I don't think they were setting out, as people did in the 1890s, to celebrate Indian removal, right? Or the devastation of native peoples, but there's a subtext there that they're choosing not to investigate, right? Okay. So here in Oregon, meanwhile, is gearing up to celebrate the sesquicentennial of the Overland Trail, right? And so there's a 150th anniversary of the Oregon Trail celebration, major celebration being planned, and we start having backlash against that, right? This isn't something some are arguing this isn't something we should be celebrating. This isn't something we should be talking about. The Oregon Trail Coordinating Council, which was planning the sesquicentennial celebration, commissioned this sculpture by sculptor David Manuel and donated it to the city of Portland to mark the sesquicentennial of the trail. And it was to join, of course, Portland, if you've probably all seen, Portland has a rich history of public art, particularly sculpture, on their park blocks in downtown Portland. And the original intention was to place this monument in the North Park blocks. They were going to surround it with quotes from Oregon Trail diaries representing the history of the trail. Okay. And artistically, it doesn't look that different from the pioneer families that have been going up since the 1940s, right? Okay, it all seems okay. Except people are starting to question these things, and there are a few other problems. The son is carrying a Bible, right? So there's a religion, and with a very obvious cross on it. Lots of these sculptures have Bibles on them, but usually not quite that explicit. And more problematic yet, the title of the sculpture is "The Promised Land." Okay, so when you take a rifle, a Bible, and a title, "The Promised Land," now we have a problem in Portland in 1992, right? And so there's a vocal contingent in Portland who object to this monument. Now, the artists in art world in Portland is saying, well, it's kind of ugly and it's not good art, so we don't want it. Others are saying, oh no, you cannot put up this glorification of white dominance of native peoples in Portland. That we just can't do this. And so they temporarily place it in front of the Oregon Historical Society Museum as a sort of place to put it during the sesquicentennial celebration, and they're like, okay, now we'll figure it out. They came up with a location. People couldn't accept the North Park block's location. So he went back to the drawing board, had a second site committee charged with finding a new location. In the meantime, they had to do something with sculpture. So they moved it across the Willamette River to Lloyd Center and plunked it on a pillar in Lloyd Center where it was overlooking the Max tracks. So it had lots of people speeding by. And Dad was pointing west along the Max train, right? Okay. So it takes them several years. They finally settled on moving it to Chapman Square, which is part of the original plat of the town of Portland. This is kind of an odd choice in that Chapman Square has a long history of contestation over inclusivity. There were anti-Chinese riots in the square in the 1880s. In the 1920s, it was designated as a women-only space to protect them from sexual harassment while they were eating their lunch. Right, so this is sort of an odd choice. Okay. I should back up a moment and say, there were lots of other places that wanted the sculpture, so Portland's like, where can we hide it, right? Meanwhile, the Dalles, Silverton, Springfield, and many others are saying, hey, we'll take it. Like, I don't know what's wrong with you crazy people up in Portland, but we'll take it, right? So we have a sort of urban and rural divide, if you will, right? Or city and smaller town divide, where some people really are offended by the piece, others are like, hey, this is our history. We want to celebrate our heritage and connection to the trail, right? And we have lots of places saying, no, we're the end of the trail. No, we're the end of the trail. It should come here. Okay, so Portland isn't really ready to give it up, but they're not really ready to celebrate it either. And so they kind of hide it in Chapman Square. Ironically, since then, the North Park blocks have declined in influence and Chapman Square has increased in visibility. And as the financial district has grown in Portland in the last couple decades, folks in Lloyd Center wanted to keep it, by the way. The business owners there liked it as well, right? So we have a variety of people interested in the status and fighting over the meaning of the sculpture. Okay. So what about here in Eugene? I haven't uncovered anyone really talking about the pioneer mother and father in Eugene in the early 1990s. It doesn't seem to have been very controversial here as far as I've been able to uncover at the time. But jump forward a generation, in the last 3 or 4 years, as the general public across the country has been talking about Confederate monuments, right? There's been renewed interest in what the meaning of public art. And so the Pioneer Father and Pioneer Mother have come, and particularly Pioneer Father, have come under scrutiny, particularly as we come up on the centennial of that sculpture in the midst of all this public debate. And people have started to question their meaning and legacy and future, as well as you guys noted, the potential renaming of buildings on campus. Just last year, a group of students at U of O created a temporary art installation that sought to reinterpret these statues and respond to them. For the Pioneer Father, a group of students created a plexiglass box in which they layered a series of materials, soil and leaves and various other objects representing white settlement, in which they called the piece "Destiny Manifested." Okay, so questioning this notion of manifest destiny. And then the Pioneer Mother, they made a play on the words on the sculpture. So it says on the base, Pioneer Mother, and then Pax, Latin for peace. And so this installation they called Peace Pax, for who? And they installed a series of white sort of marker signs, arrows, that might, the type of thing that might point toward historic sites. But on each of those posts, they placed text describing a racially charged incident over the past 100 years or so in Eugene and the surrounding area, trying to emphasize the ways in which racial tension persists in Oregon. And then this has gotten, I think, far more attention. The story got picked up by Breitbart that earlier this spring there was vandalism with red spray paint the remnants of which are still visible as of this afternoon. I went to check it out, and they stuck googly eyes on him. Okay. But for the most part, I think the Pioneer Mother sort of remains under the radar screen, at least for now, right? The Pioneer Father has been sort of the flashpoint for all of this. Okay. So moving forward then, these are really complex stories and complex questions, right? In the case of the Pioneer Father, we have really clear archival evidence that the artist, the donor, and the people who spoke at its dedication all intended this to be a racist monument in 21st century terms, right? They intended to celebrate white conquest, although they would have used slightly different words to describe it. The Pioneer Mother was less explicit, but the subtext hopefully is quite clear in the context of what is going on at the time. And these are questions then for us to ponder moving forward about what do these monuments mean, and what, if anything, do we want to do about that? Okay, so that's the end of my history lesson for tonight. If I may do just a moment of self-promotion, I put some postcards on the table, and I have more if I didn't spread it out. So I have a book which is available for sale tonight. I also have a website, so you can check out some of this information for free. The website's still a work in progress, but tells more in-depth stories of individual statues that didn't necessarily make it into the book. And there's a cool interactive map where you can drag the timeline and watch the monuments pop up over time and space. Kind of cool. And I've also been working on Clio, which is an app intended to be kind of the Yelp of historical sites, where you can, anywhere where you live or where you're on vacation, you can pull up their app or website and say what historic sites are near me. And they also have create walking tours of various sites. So I'm in the process of putting the 200 sculptures that I've studied into Clio so that people can find them, and also have been in the process of creating tours that you can actually take walking or driving tours, or you can take them virtually from the comfort of your own home on your computer, so you can tour the monuments of Portland or Oregon at large, and other states across the country will be coming soon.
So did you say Clio or?
Clio. It's theclio.com. TheClio, or Clio app for your smartphone. And so that's a great chance to sort of explore these things on your own. And it's also, if you can't find that, it's linked from my website, so you can get there that way as well. And there's a QR code for the website. Okay, so that's what I had, but I would love to hear from all of you and open it up for question and discussion. No, I don't think I do know about a controversy in Helena, Montana.
It's, they had a whole series of statues in one area of Confederates.
Confederate monuments in Helena, Montana, that people were surprised to learn that there are Confederate monuments outside of the former Confederate states, right, and have been told. So they were removed. Okay, that part I had not heard. Okay.
I thought the shifting described between the male and female figures really interesting, and I was wondering, especially in the 20s and 30s, if it was connected to the eugenics movement in some way, sort of fertility of the mother at that moment.
So he was commenting on the transition from male to female pioneers in the 1920s and asking if there was a connection to the eugenics movement. There absolutely is. I don't know that I have any, I should say, I don't have any direct evidence of people saying, I'm going to further the eugenics movement by putting up this monument. Can't connect the dots that directly, but there certainly is this conversation, a very pro-natalist conversation going on in the 1920s. right? Pronatalist for certain kinds of people, right? It's not accidental that series of Madonna of the Trail monuments I showed you, if I get back to it, were put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution, right? Who are maybe not explicitly involved in eugenics directly, but certainly interested in promoting certain kinds of motherhood, right? Remembering certain kinds of people who are true Americans, and so yeah, I would say it's not a direct connect the dots that I've been able to make, but I would say it's certainly part of the same conversation about who we celebrate, right? Who should be having children, who should be mothering at this time. It's a specific kind of people, and it's specifically people descended from Northern Europeans whose family had been here for generations and then moved west. Not more recent arrivals and not people of color.
Are there comparable statues around the West of the kind of noble savage caricature, like Mr. Proctor has a sculpture of an Indian maiden petting a deer at the U of O Art Museum, things like that?
Yeah, questions about depictions of noble savages in sculpture, and Proctor certainly is involved in this. Just lost his name. Sculptor of the monument in Salt Lake City. Cyrus Dallin was also famous for sculpting Native spiritual leaders and Native military, or well, I shouldn't say military leaders, but because they wouldn't have casted those terms, right? But the noble savage image is very much present in this time period, and it's all the same people sculpting all of these. So in some cases, some of those towers of white supremacy that we see going up between about 1890 and 1910, many of them actually include noble savages at the bottom, right? And then we progress up from there to the pioneers. In Salt Lake City, it's Brigham Young who's the pinnacle, right? In Denver, the Frederick McMonnies made a tower at which he placed a Plains Indian warrior on horseback at the top of the pillar, and then he had a miner and a pioneer and a pioneer mother, I think it was, at the bottom. People of Denver freaked out about that as well, because they read it in a traditional way, which was that the civilized pinnacle was at the pinnacle of the tower, and you read progress from bottom to top rather than top to bottom. And so they said, oh, no, you can have a noble savage, but he can't be the pinnacle, right? And so I went back and forth, and McMonnies eventually compromised by replacing the Plains Indian warrior with Kit Carson, an Indian fighter, on rearing horseback instead. So it's certainly then part of this conversation as well.
I know that two-dimensional art is very different than sculptural art, and I'm familiar more so with the former. But I wonder, especially in some of the 90s more contemporary sculptures, especially the Promised Land, is there any indication that some of that could have been created with a sense of sarcasm, or like it's over the top? I mean, the big cross and the rifle is like really.
Did you all hear that question? So she was talking about two-dimensional versus three-dimensional art and asking if there was any sarcasm in these monuments in the 1990s. In terms of treatment of Native peoples, no, I don't see that. We do start to see, beginning in the a little bit later, in late 1990s really, and into the early 2000s, we start to see spunky pioneer mothers. Prescott Valley, Arizona puts up the not-so-gentle tamer, who has just killed a rattlesnake with her hoe or shovel or something. Tom, blanking on his last name, Tom Otterness sculpted, it was originally part of an installation at the in Sacramento, and then he enlarged it later. A covered wagon that has, Dad is the bull pulling the wagon, Mom is sitting on the wagon box with a pipe in her mouth, driving the wagon, and the daughter is throwing her little brother out the back of the covered wagon. And the artist's commentary was, it's just like the family road trip, with the kids fighting in the back seat, right? So he's likening the Overland Trail experience to the 1850s Overland Oregon Trail to 1950s epic family road trip to visit the national parks or whatever they would be doing in the 1950s, right? So we start to see some humor on those terms, right? Challenging the gender roles. But I'm not seeing humor when it comes to the racial depictions. You do have some pushback. For example, in northwest Oklahoma, in Enid, Oklahoma, they put up a pioneer family, but the artist, then some native people in the area, then hired the same artist to sculpt a native person as a peacemaker rather than as a warrior, and they erected that in the town as an alternate narrative to the pioneer family and the white man on horseback claiming his land in a land rush, right? So there's a little bit of pushback in those terms, but I don't see sort of sarcastic depictions in the art. And I think that's partly a reflection of the difference between treatments of gender and race in those decades. But it's also that not only is the sculpture, it's public monuments, right? And public monuments then, by their very nature, are celebratory, and they're also inherently conservative, I would argue, right? In order to put up a public monument, you have to have people willing to do it and pay for it, right? You're talking $50,000, $100,000 in today's dollars or more, depending on the size of the sculpture. You have to have somebody willing to provide the land, right, and being willing to accept it and maintain it. And then you have to have at least a significant minority of the population who supports the thing, right, in order to get it up. Because if you're going to put it on public land, it has to represent something that at least a large portion of the population supports, right? Now, if you're going to do it on private land, that's a little different. There's a controversy in New Mexico about a sculpture of Juan de Oñate, who is a Spanish conqueror, that was placed on private land, but has been attacked by vandals or activists, depending on your perspective, right? And Oñate's, if you know any of that history, so Oñate was part of the reconquest of the New Mexico in 1692, and for those who had been part of the Pueblo Revolt, he cut off their right foot, and so some unnamed individuals have cut off the right foot of the Oñate sculpture. So there is some pushback on this, but that's very unusual, right, to have that level of pushback against these monuments.
Do you think that the use of public sculptures in the discourse around the history of the supplemental, the view of the history of the supplemental West has been exhausted, or do you think there's a future for a expansion or a clarification, more nuanced view of what happened?
I'm sorry, I only partially heard your question. So the question was, has the effort to commemorate been exhausted? Was that the question?
The discourse around the settlement of the West hasn't been exhausted when it comes to the use of public art, or is there a future to make that dialogue more nuanced?
Okay, so the question is about the future of the dialogue surrounding these issues. Is there room for more nuance and further development? I think there really is.
Not where there's room for it. That's obvious. Right?
But will it actually happen?
Yes.
I think it will happen in some places and not others. Portland and Eugene, I think, and San Francisco. And in fact, San Francisco, I started with their monument. That early days portion there was actually removed last fall to an undisclosed location in fine art storage for the time being. And the intention, for the last I heard, is to leave that the pedestal it stood on empty and put up a plaque explaining why it's empty. But that's still being fought in the courts, as well as the court of public opinion, right? So I think that there are places where there is enough political will and enough activism to make these conversations continue and potentially see things happen. I don't think that Goodland, Kansas is gonna, if I can get back to that one, lost it. I don't think Goodland, Kansas is gonna take this down, nor are they ready to even hear that there's a potential problem with it, right? And, Oklahoma City just put this up 10 years ago. Now, there has been conversation there, right? An artist, activist, put installed skulls on the site, right? And making commentary. So it's not to say there's not pushback in other locations, but I don't see a lot of political will coming out of Oklahoma City to take down something they just put up, right? They see this as part of a substantial redevelopment of a potential tourist location, and I think most of the people in power in Oklahoma City see that as being a useful thing. So there is conversation around these things, even in Oklahoma City, but I'm not expecting it to go very far, right? And so, or if it happens, I don't think it's going to be removing this, right? But there are lots of ways to respond to monuments, right? I had a conversation earlier today with a few in this room about this, that there are lots of ways you can respond. So removing it is one possible option, right? Putting up an interpretive plaque is another. But there are other ways as well, right? Like the example I gave you from Enid, Oklahoma, where they're like, okay, well, we're going to put up our own sculpture, right? Or maybe we need to put up lots of sculptures. If the only depiction of women we have is in a sunbonnet, Pioneer Mother in a sunbonnet, or if the only depiction we have of Native people is in this tower of white supremacy, then maybe what we need is more public art that gives different depictions of Native people, right? That maybe doesn't immediately impact that particular monument, but changes the larger, either that plaza or that city, right? Gives it a different impact. There have also been interesting things done so far with two-dimensional art, with using plexiglass, right? That you place plexiglass in front of the object and then put text or alternate image on the plexiglass. So you're not destroying the art, but you're confronting people visually, right? In such a way that it impacts the way that they view the historic piece of art. I don't think that's a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think it's a really intriguing way of thinking about, well, how can we take this piece, keep it here, but reinterpret it in a way that is meaningful, right? Because realistically, bronze plaques people don't read them, right? And that early days sculpture in San Francisco, they put up a plaque in 1996. You can't see it because they've planted landscaping around it and you can't even get to it. You have to climb through the sharp grasses to get to it. I don't think, so I'm an educator, right? Yes, let's interpret it. Realistically, I don't think plaques are a very effective way to accomplish that in most settings.
Is there any pushback from the East Coast, for example, Plymouth Rock is early 10 years?
So the question is whether there's pushback on the East Coast against Plymouth Rock or the earliest white settlers. I believe it's the Museum of Natural History in New York City was one of the places where the example I was just giving of plexiglass. They had a mural depicting, I think it was like, the purchase of Long Island or whatever, or purchase of Manhattan, right? This is the land, and depicting it as a very positive sort of experience. And they put up a plexiglass shield and text saying, pointing out things that are wrong with the depiction of the historical inaccuracies of the image, right? So that's one example that I know of. There are a few others where there's been some pushback in New England as well. I haven't been hearing pushback in southern, in say Virginia, right? My sense is that that's not something people are paying a lot of attention to in the southern states, southeast, because the Confederate issue is much more pressing, I think, for them than treatment. It might come, but I think it's going to take a while for that to bubble up to the surface, for the media to pick up on it at least, because the Confederate issue is so much at the forefront there. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all. I enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you again, Cynthia, and I would like to remind you that if you want more, her books are for sale, and she'll be happy to autograph them for you.